All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Habalin, Latova, Melon, Karen Ram, dedicating all the Shimon Droshos this month in honor of their friends, David Avram ben Yaakov Yosef Halevi and Yitzchak Zalman ben Shmuel David, for joining the Daf Shir and remaining committed through some of the hardest Masechtas. We look forward to dancing together with them at the Siyum Hashas. Beautiful. Our day of learning sponsor, Adina Hirsch, in loving memory of her father, Tzvi Binyamin ben Hachaver Naftali, Zichron of the Brach on the occasion of his 8th yahrzeit. You hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama have an aliyah, their family, Einachama, all those who need a refuah shav, and together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu Shlim Eretz shower, Brach and Besoros Tovos upon Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Gimel 33, and we are picking up on Lamed Beis Amud Beis 32b, and we left off Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, the first wide line on the bottom of the daf. Really great sugya ahead of us today. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So we're still focusing on the halachos of mezuzah. So in this case over here, quite literally, it means if you put the mezuzah and you suspended it in a rod, ultimately it is pasul. Now, what does that mean? You put it in a, so look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, tzla'a lemezuzah al pesach b'makal. So we'll say, so in this case over here, what you're doing is, as opposed to affixing the mezuzah on the doorpost, if you can imagine, you're putting it in, imagine like a reed, like a hollow reed, you're putting it like in a tube, and you're suspending it so that it's laying on the doorpost. It is not embedded in the doorpost, rather it's laying on the doorpost. So interestingly enough, position-wise, it's in the right position, except instead of being, let's say, affixed to the doorpost, it is simply suspended on the doorpost. What is the halacha? Psula. Ultimately, again, that is ineffective. Why is that? My taima b'sha'arecha ba'inan. Because we'll say this is interesting. The Torah says that where do you put them? Uksaftam al mezuzos beisecha uvisharecha. Ultimately, again, you should go ahead and write it on your mezuzah, on the doorposts of your home. Bisharecha. Bisharecha means in your gates. The Gemara understands to mean that the mezuzah itself must be actively affixed to the sha'ar, to the doorpost. Interesting. That supports this. If you suspended the mezuzah on the doorway, or you put it behind the door, sakana ve'in ba mitzvah. Ultimately, I suppose if you look at Rashi says, shenicha achorei hadelas, shekava b'kosa achorei hadelas. In this case over here, instead of putting it on the doorpost, you're actually affixing it behind the doorpost. So again, one is not yotze the mitzvah in this case, and they actually brings out there's two issues. Number one, sakana, there's a danger, and number two, in ba mitzvah, there is no mitzvah. So if you look at Rashi says sakana mina mazikin she'ein habayis mishtamer ba achik ba'ena b'tzuras hapesach kilchasa. So first again, I will say mezuzah does two things, as we're going to discuss. Number one, mezuzah goes ahead and protects. What is it protecting against? Rashi says mazikin. Now mazikin classically means spiritually destructive forces, whatever that might be. Shedim, ruach tuma, whatever it might be. Therefore, again, I need the mezuzah al sakana. So again, but if the mezuzah is not affixed in the right place, it does not protect against sakana. Furthermore, ve'in ba mitzvah. And obviously, I haven't fulfilled the letter of the law. So I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, it's actually interesting. This comes up sometimes when a person, let's say, moves into a home, right? So ideally, one is supposed to put up their mezuzahs as quickly as possible. Sometimes, for a variety of logistical reasons, you're not able to. There is a din of making sure that one puts up the mezuzah on their front door as quickly as possible. That should be done day one, even if it might take a bit more time, although it's not ideal for the rest of the mezuzahs. The idea being that front door mezuzah is incredibly important, als mazikin, destructive forces. Okay, Shalbeis Munvaz. So Shalbeis Munvaz Amelch. Well, this is very interesting. The members of the household of King Munvaz, Hayu Osin Bepundiko Sehen Ben Kain Zechelemuz. Sorry, Hayu Osin Bepun Kido Sehen Kain Zechelemuzozah. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So the members of the house of Munvaz traveled a lot. They traveled, on business for the court, so for the king's court. So what would happen? They often were not home. Now again, we're going to talk about this. Mezuzah is a din in diras keva, not in diras arai. There's only an obligation to put a mezuzah on your permanent domicile, not on temporary domicile. This is important. This is why, for example, we don't put up a mezuzah on a sukkah. Right? Sukkah has no din of mezuzah because sukkah is a temporary structure. So you're going on a business trip, you're going on vacation, staying in a hotel. There's no obligation on mezuzah. Here's what's interesting. The members of the king's court, of Munvaz's court, they traveled often. They were never home. Literally never home. Because they were never home, they never had the opportunity to go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah of mezuzah. So what they would do is, whenever they would check into their hotel, they would put a mezuzah on the door. Not because there was an obligation to do so, but again, that's his lashon zecher lemezuzah. Because again, they knew that they were never really going to fulfill the actual mitzvah. So in order to do something that was a zecher, that was a remembrance, they did this. Take a look at Rashi. It's actually quite beautiful. Rashi says over here, how you osim bepunkudosehen. Pundak hainu beis shalom by shalom bo over drachim baderech. So remember again, a pundak is a hotel. Vein chayav b'mezuzah delav diras kevahu. And again, a hotel is not chayav b'mezuzah because it is not a permanent structure. Kidisanya lekaman ba'atchilas hadar dar bepundki v'eretz Yisrael kol shloshim yom patam min hamezuzah v'shal beis munbas hamelach yishayim mahalchim baderech. No sin mezuzahs imahen v'tolin osam bepundak b'makel. So this is interesting. That very procedure that the Gemara said before is ineffective for mezuzah. Meaning, if you put your mezuzah, in a tube and you suspend it on the doorway, that is not an effective mezuzah. Why not? B'sha'arecha, it has to be embedded on the doorpost. Yet this is what the members of Munvaz's house did. Lefisha hayudarin liolam diras v'shelo hayudarin liolam diras keva. So again, interestingly enough, this is just a fascinating practice. They were not obligated to mezuzah, but again, had they not done this, they would never have any shaykhs to mezuzah. So they did this zecher lemezuzah. Quite beautiful. From Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Pesach. It is a mitzvah to go ahead and put the mezuzah literally again in the hollow part of the doorway. Chalalo shal Pesach means the width of the doorway. The Gemara says pshita, that's obvious. B'sha'arecha amrachmana. Torah says you should put the mezuzah b'sha'arecha, ultimately in your gates. So it seems to be quite straightforward. So the Gemara says, what's the havamina? I would have thought as follows. Since Rava says mitzvah lahanicha, top of Lamed Gimel 33a, betevach hasamoch l'rshus harabim. Since Rabbi says, so again, there's a lot of interesting halachas, and this is pretty much all halacha l'maisa so far, everything we've seen. But since Rabbi said that there is a mitzvah to put the mezuzah betevach hasamoch l'rshus harabim. Now, what that means is as follows. So mitzvah means that obviously the doorway itself has a width. Now, we're going to talk about on the height and the width of the doorway where you should put the mezuzah. From the width perspective, the Gemara says you should put the mezuzah within the tefach of the exterior of the doorway. Right? So in other words, if you have let's say a very wide doorway, the mezuzah should be put within a tefach of the exterior of the doorway. So b'tefach ha'masal l'shus harabim kamad demarchik. So there, I would have thought like this. I would have thought kamad demarchik mali. Therefore, based on that, I would have thought that halacha l'maisa, perhaps the more you could distance the mezuzah from the home, the better off you are. And maybe even you should put it mamish like on the outside wall of the house, not even in the doorway. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, the mezuzah has to go in the doorway. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, B'tevach hasamach l'shus harabim. Rashi says, Ki da'amr l'kaman dekadim paga b'mitzvah. The idea of saying, now what's the logic ultimately again of putting the mezuzah within a tefach of the exterior of the doorway? Because this way, when you come home, you encounter the mitzvah sooner. So it's such a beautiful idea. This way you encounter the mitzvah mezuzah sooner. The closer it is to the exterior of the home, the sooner you encounter it. Skip next Rashi. So I would have thought, since we want you to encounter your mezuzah as quickly as possible upon returning home, maybe put it on the actual outside wall of the home. Kamash malano b'sha'arecha, it has to go in the actual doorway itself. Incredible. So we'll say, so again, I just want to point out, we're picking up a lot of really incredible halachas of Hilchos Mezuzah. So halacha number one, the mezuzah itself must be firmly affixed to the doorway, as opposed to putting it, let's say, in a tube and suspending it in the right position. Can't do it. It has to actually be affixed to the doorway itself. Only a diras keva, only a permanent domicile, ultimately again is obligated in mezuzah, but yet the people of the house of Munvaz ultimately went ahead and put a zecher on the mezuzah, which apparently seems to be fine as well. The halacha number three, you must put the mezuzah in the width of the doorway within one tefach of the exterior. So width of the doorway within one tefach of the exterior. Good. Let's go back there. Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph 33a, second line down. Rabbi Shmuel Kasva Ashnei Dapin Psula. Another interesting case over here. If you wrote the mezuzah literally on two dapin, now we'll say now what that sounds like over here is two pieces of parchment. Right? So if you wrote the mezuzah on two pieces, Rashi says chatzia b'daf zeh, the chatzia b'daf zeh. So right, one on one piece, or we'll say alternatively, what we could also see what it means is that halacha l'maaseh two different columns. Two different columns. That seems to be pashtos a bit more, right? If you wrote the mezuzah, now remember again, we spoke about yesterday the machlokes of psuchos versus stumos, but one thing seems to be clear, which is you're writing the mezuzah in one column. What happens if you wrote the mezuzah on two columns, or for that matter, two pieces of parchment? What's the halacha? Psula. Ultimately, again, the mezuzah is pasul. The mezuzah is pasul. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, the Gemara raises the kasha, Kasva ashnei dapin ve'nicha b'shnei sifin. So again, you're supposed to look at this brayso. If you wrote the mezuzah on two dapin, two columns, in this case it's two parchments, ve'nicha b'shnei sifin, and you put it on, let's say you have a doorway with a double post, and you put it on two posts. So what's the halacha? Ve'nicha b'shnei sifin psula. Ultimately, again, the mezuzah is going to be pasul. Ha b'saf echad. Now, what that sounds like is if you had a two-column mezuzah that you put on one doorpost, it would be kosher. To which the Gemara says, no. Ru'uya l'shnei sifin ka'amar. What it means is if you use the mezuzah, which could be used for two doorposts. What's an example of a mezuzah that could be used for two doorposts? A mezuzah maybe that's written in two columns has empty parchment in between the two columns and could be snipped in half. So if you wrote a mezuzah like that, ultimately, again, the mezuzah is going to be pasul. Rashi says over here, Ru'uya l'shnei sifin, sheniach gvil, chalak bein daf ledaf. You left empty parchment between one column and the other. U'ru'uyin l'chalik l'shtayim, chatzia lakan, v'chatzia lakan. So let's say again, you left, in other words, there's a mezuzah that's ra'i to be split into two. So halacha l'maisa, that will not work. Right? Halacha l'maisa, such a mezuzah will be ineffective. Vam Rabbi Shmuel, the mezuzah, so we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, and that's also, so that's why we see a mezuzah is written as one column. And apparently the Gemara says if you write it in two columns, the mezuzah is going to be pasul. Vam Rabbi Shmuel. So it's another interesting halacha. B'mezuzah halach achar heker tzir. So we'll say the Gemara now deals with what is probably one of the most interesting and most common shalas in Hilchos Mezuzah. You have a doorway in between two rooms. The mezuzah, as we know, although we haven't seen this yet in the Gemara, but we'll discuss it, is put on the right side. Put on the right side. So we'll say now that's the right side of the entrance. Sometimes what's the shalah in Hilchos Mezuzah? What's the entrance? So obviously the doorway of your home, that's obvious, right? The doorway into a room, and that room has no other form of entry, obvious. But again, as we're going to discuss, what happens if you have a doorway in between two rooms, and both of those rooms have other forms of entry as well? How do you determine which way is in? So the Gemara says, it's very, very interesting. By mezuzah what we look at literally again, heker tzir means where is the recognizable peg, or really better stated, pivot. Watch this. My heker tzir. What does that mean? Amrav Ada Avkasa. Ultimately, again, the socket of the pivot. We'll discuss this in just a moment. Hey Chidami. Let's say before we go on, look at Rashi. Rashi says Avkasa It's very interesting. Also, hur shebe isikufa shetzir hadalas sovev bo. So I will say, so the way ultimately again they didn't have like hinges on their doors. Instead, what they had was as follows: there would be some type of protrusion on one side of the door, and that protrusion would fit into a socket in the doorway. Whatever part of the doorway has the socket, that's considered to be inside. Right, so inside, I don't know, a good illustration of this, right? So again, I guess you can understand this. So whatever, in other words, you have a doorway in between two rooms. Only one of those rooms is going to have the socket in its interior, and then the pegs of the door fit into that socket. Whichever room has the socket, ultimately again is considered to be quote unquote inside. That's the entry point. So therefore, again, that's what you look for. You look for whichever room has the socket, and then again, that's the direction of going in. That's how the door is primarily accessed, and mezuzah therefore will go on that right side. So the Gemara says, "Hey chidami," they will say, by the way, for our purposes, often what this means is we look at which room does the door swing in. If the door swings in, ultimately, again, that's considered to be the form of entry. And therefore, again, mezuzah will go on the right side. It's not always true like that. But often that's the way it occurs. Eridami, what's the case? Kigon, Pischa, now the Gemara says, where does this come up? Listen to this. Kigon, Pischa, the Bain Trey Bati. This could be like the entranceway between two homes. Now, it doesn't really mean two homes, it really means two rooms. Bein begavri, bein nashi. Between the room in your house, there's a men's room and there's a women's room. Not lavatories over here, right? This is actually talking about, again, there would be a room for men and a room for women. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean? Feels like a new chumrah coming up over here, right? What does this mean? A men's room in your house, a women's room in your house? It's actually very interesting. Rashi says, "Kigon pischa the tray bate begavri beinashi adam shecholik beso chetziav lehiluch hanashim hamachzirin beveso v'chetziav leishto lasos melachta." So we'll say, so really what this was like this. It would be common, at least in Talmudic times, that a man would have, let's say a man was having over some other men. He would have a place where they could gather, but there would also be a separate part where his wife could still be, either with friends of her own or just doing whatever it is that she's doing. That's what it calls, they're calling it a men's area and a women's area. It doesn't matter about the gender. What matters about this is that these were two rooms. Now Rashi says, "V'yesh Pesach bein zu lezu, uPesach l'chol bayis l'reshus harabim." Now, here's the chap, right? So there was a door in between, or an entranceway, right? A doorway in between these two rooms. Now here's the other chap. Each of these rooms also had an additional exit, right? Because remember, as we said before, if you have a doorway between two rooms, right? Let's say room 1 shares a doorway with room 2. But room 2 has no other form of exit, then obviously, again, assuming we're following the flow of traffic, we'll view that as an entry from room 1 to room 2. In this case over here, the men's room and the women's room both had other forms of exit. So the shaila was, Rashi says, Vamina lakamon, mezuzah derech yamin lebiyah, and actually it's tomorrow's daf. We'll see that mezuzah is put on the right side, v'lo liyitziyah. V'hacha b'pesach shebein zu lezu lo yadinan hey lachshav biyah v'hei lachshav yitziyah. Hei yitziyah mehai lahai v'i mehai lahai. So the problem with this is each of these rooms had another form of exit, had another doorway. So the issue is that shared doorway, how do you view it? Do you view it ultimately, again, as going from the men's room to the women's room, or from the women's room to the men's room? That's the shaila. So finish up Rashi. Rashi says, so in this case over here, what do we look for? We look for the pivot. We look for the socket for the pivot. Which room has that? And whichever room has that, then it's considered to be, that's the direction we look at going in. So let's say, for example, the socket was in the women's room, then ultimately, again, we would view the doorway as an entry into the women's room, and we will put the mezuzah on that right side. Incredible. Incredible. Fine. So go back to Rashi. Let's go back to the Gemara. So ultimately, again, that's an example of a shared doorway. So again, the Talmudic resolution for a shared doorway is even a shared. Now, the resolution would be we look at which room has the socket for the door pivot. Whichever one has the socket for the door pivot, that's considered to be the direction in, and therefore, again, we would view that as a form of entry into that room, and therefore put the mezuzah on that right side. Of course, obviously, that only works if there's a door. If there's no door, we'll discuss that as well. Incredible. Okay, so also let's go back there. Reish Galusa, very interesting case over here. Reish Galusa, Bana Besa. The Reish Galusa went and built a home. All right. Amar Le Rav Nachman, Kavali Mizuzasa. So the Reish Galusa said to Rav Nachman, do me a favor, put up a mezuzah in my house. Put up my mezuzahs. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. Amar Rav Nachman, Tali Dasha Beresha. Ultimately, put up your doorposts first. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Tali Dashi Beresha. Ha'emid hasifa bebinyan trila bi'achar kach kav'inu ha'mezuzos. Da'aminon mitzitzis dichsev ba te'asa. So it says we're going to see that mezuzah shares an interesting quality, both that tzitzis has as well as that we see by sukkah, or what's called te'asa min ha'asui. That again, the mezuzah must be affixed to the doorpost. In other words, if you put a mezuzah there first, and then you went ahead and built the doorpost around it, that does not work. The mezuzah must be affixed. So it's interestingly enough, so it must have been that the Reish Galusa approached Rav Nachman in the early construction phase, even before the doorposts were finished. And the Reish Galusa said, you know what, do me a favor, put the mezuzah in the frame. Put it in the frame, the doorpost is not there. And Rav Nachman says, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to build a doorpost first. Rashi says over here, I'm reading the real of that Rashi, if I put, Rav Nachman said, if I put the mezuzah now in the doorpost, v'hadar hasifa bebinyan hazeh, havele aseh hamezuzah kodem shetavi lidei mitzvah. So again, Rav Nachman says, if I put up the mezuzah now, before there's an active doorpost, an actual doorpost, it's not going to fulfill the mitzvah. So it's like quite fascinating. You have to put the doorpost up first before you go ahead and affix the mezuzah. So we'll say a tremendous musar haskell as well. The mezuzah ultimately represents almost like the culmination. You know, it's interesting. I was like, Rabbi Yitzchak Kabaditchev says, why does a yid build a home? Why does a yid build a home? Because you need somewhere to put your mezuzah, right? In other words, that like there's a mitzvah of mezuzah. I can't fulfill the mitzvah. Ultimately, again, if I don't build a home. So really, mezuzah represents the culmination of the efforts of building a home. You built a structure, you built a home. Now, how do you infuse kedusha into that home? You put the mezuzah on that doorpost. But the musar haskell is that there's a sequence to accomplishment in life. And if you want to accomplish things, right? If you want your mezuzah, you need to build your structure. The challenge so often in life is that we want certain spiritual perks. We want certain spiritual benefits. We want to achieve certain spiritual levels. But what we're not willing to do is put in the time to create the appropriate spiritual infrastructure. You can only have the mezuzah if you build the doorpost. Life is, in order to become accomplished in ruchnius, there must be a sequential order of things. We'll say this is why we speak about this all the time. This notion of, let's say, starting out your day with Torah, starting out your day with tefillah. These are building blocks. These are building blocks that then allow you to put additional things on your doorpost as you go throughout the day. But if you haven't created a structure, right? If you haven't created the domicile, if you haven't created the actual doorpost, there's nowhere to put the mezuzah. If one wants to grow in a ruchni way, there has to be a clear, articulated plan of action. If it's hodgepodge, a little here, a little there, up here, up here, it's beautiful. You get credit for everything, but you're not building a spiritual edifice. You want a spiritual accomplishment in life? Build your home, then put the mezuzah on the doorpost. Such an incredible yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, another interesting case over here. Good. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Amrav Yehuda Amrav, Asal Kimin Nagar Psula. Interesting case. Literally, again, if you made your mezuzah, nagar is like a peg or a bolt. Now, both say, now we'll see exactly what this means. If you made your mezuzah like a peg or like a bolt, it's puzzle. Really, is that true? Now, both say, now, interestingly enough, Rashi says over here, Asal Kimin Nagar, Shekava Vitachva Besaf, Kinagar Shetokfa Nagar Bekosa. So, we'll say, if you can imagine as follows. Actually, Rashi has an image over here. Right? It says, if you put in your mezuzah like a bolt, what does this mean? So a bolt is put into a structure horizontally, right? So if you go ahead and you drive in your mezuzah into the door, or not drive in, right? You bore out a hole and you put it in like laying down horizontally, that is puzzle. That is puzzle. Such a mezuzah does not work. So the Gemara says, is that true? Is that true? Ini v'haki as Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef Amar kulu mezuzasa debei Rabbi kemin nagar havu avidan. Yet again, the Gemara Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef says all the mezuzahs of the house of Rabbi were made like a bolt. To which the Gemara says, kemin nagar havu avdinan. So how can you say that? So the Gemara says, furthermore, the statement continues. Vahi pischa da'al bei Rabbi lebei midrasha. And again, furthermore, so there are two statements being made over. Rabbi Shmuel Silber said two statements. Number one, all of the mezuzahs in Rabbi's home were put in like a bolt. Statement number two is Rabbi had his own entrance into the base medrash, and there was no mezuzah on that entrance. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is going to analyze both of these statements. Number one, lo kashya. So in terms of the bolt, had da'avida kisichsa, had da'avida ki is turia, ki is tavira. So one is ultimately, again, when you make the bolt kisichsa. Kisichsa means horizontally. So we'll say if the bolt is made horizontally, then halacha l'maisa the mezuzah is possible. Literally, again, had davida ki is tavira means the bolt was made, I will say quite literally, like an ankle. Like an ankle. So like an ankle means vertically. So again, interesting enough, what the Gemara is saying is like this, and the Rebbe says it's very important. You can embed a mezuzah in the doorway. Now again, we're going to qualify that in just a little bit, but technically speaking, see, we classically think about a mezuzah as something that's being put on the doorway. So we're going to see you can embed a mezuzah in a doorway. We'll discuss the parameters of that. And that's what it means you put it in like a bolt. So you can put it in like a bolt, again, vertically in the doorway. If you put it in horizontally, ultimately such a mezuzah is going to be puzzle. So the Gemara says, furthermore, the Gemara says, "Ini v'hahi pischa." Now again, the second statement that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef said is that Rebbe would go ahead and Rebbe had an entranceway to the base medrash, which he did not put a mezuzah on. So the Gemara says, furthermore, "Ini v'ha ahu pischa dahave ayil ba Rav Huna lebei midrasha." So once I say, but 1 second, Rav Huna also had his own entranceway to the base medrash, and he did put a mezuzah on it. Now, interestingly enough, by the way, why do these Rebbeim have their own entrance to the mezuzah, to the base medrash? So interestingly enough, okay, see, normally think about it because every rabbi needs an escape door, right? You need an escape door. You have to be able to get out of the building without running into balabatim, right? This is the way that it works. This is not a new thing, right? So interesting, that's not the reason. That's not the reason. Interesting, the Gemara says over here, if you look at Rashi, the Ayalei the Pesach Katan Hayla the Rabbi Eitzam Makomo v'nichnas v'yatzabo Kadesh liyatriach tamidav la'amo b'fanav im ya'avar lefneihem. So I say, interestingly enough, the issue was if Rebbe had to use the same entrance, that means he'd have to come in the main entrance. When he came in the main entrance, that means everybody would have to stand up when he walked in, which obviously, again, could create a disturbance in the base medrash. So in order for that not to occur, Rabbi had his own private entrance, a smaller entrance to allow him to come in and come out. So the shaila is, so interestingly enough, Rebbe had this entrance, Rav Huna had this entrance. Rebbe didn't have mezuzah on that private doorway, and Rav Huna did. So what's the pshat? The Gemara says very simple. Rav Huna hahu ragil hava. So the Gemara says there's a big difference. Rebbe rarely used his private entrance. I was saying, now why did Rebbe rarely use his private entrance? What does that mean? Why not? Why not? Because he was first in the base medrash. right? That entrance was only necessary if you were coming later. Rebbe didn't need it. Rebbe was there. As opposed to Rav Huna, ultimately, again, who used it more often. So because Rav Huna used it more often, that's why I put a mezuzah on there. Rebbe did not. And I will say, this is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi says, Ragil Hava, Rov HaNichnas L'Beis Medrash Ba'osa Pesach. And I will say, now this is actually very interesting. The Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, the mezuzah halach achar haragil. When it comes to mezuzah, ultimately, again, we follow the more commonly used entrance. If you look at Rashi, halach achar haragil, im yesh beis psachim lecheder echad. If there are two entranceways into one area, so it's actually very interesting. We'll have to discuss this more, because do we actually follow this in practice? If you have two entranceways, two doorways, one is used more commonly than the other. The Gemara makes it sound like you only have to put a mezuzah on the commonly used entrance. So again, we're going to discuss whether or not that's actual halacha l'maaseh or not. But in any event, that's the distinction that the Gemara is making between the Beis Medrash entrance of Rebbe versus Rav Huna. Rav Huna used his regularly. Rebbe did not really use his regularly at all. Therefore, Rebbe did not put a mezuzah. Rav Huna did put a mezuzah. Incredible. Amar Rabbi Shmuel, mitzvah lanicha betchilas shlish sha'al yom. So we'll say very interesting. Now we're going to get into some of the actual halachas of placement. So remember again, I will say, so far we've seen before that the mezuzah is supposed to be placed on the tefach within a tefach of the exterior of the doorway, and we saw that again in order that you should encounter the mezuzah as quickly as possible upon coming home. Now the Gemara says, what about in terms of placement on the height of the doorway? So Shmuel says over here that the halacha is you shall place the mezuzah on the upper third of the door. But tchilas shlish. So what this means is, literally translated, the beginning of the upper third. So just to illustrate this, imagine for a moment, you take the doorway, you take the doorpost, you split it into thirds. Shmuel says that the mezuzah should be placed on the bottom of the upper third. So that's what it means when he says betchilas sha'alyon, on literally the beginning of the upper third, which means the bottom of the top third of the doorway. That's where the mezuzah should be placed. Okay, Rav Huna says, Magbia min hakarka tefach u'marchik min hakora tefach. Rav Huna says like this: all you need to make sure of is as follows. Number one, should be at least a tefach off the ground, and it should be at least a tefach away from the upper lintel, right, from the upper post of the doorway. So a lot more flexibility in placement. But other than that, you could put the mezuzah anywhere you want on the doorpost. So Gemara says, Gemara is the kasha, Magbia min hakarka tefach u'marchik min hakora tefach. You have to make sure to put the mezuzah at least more than a tefach off the ground, and at least more than a tefach away from the upper, what we'll call upper door beam. And the other than that, so as long as you're not putting it within a tefach of the ground and within a tefach of the upper beam, you're good to go. Otherwise, the rest of the doorway is kasher from mezuzah. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi, that's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Rabbi Yossi says, ukshartam uksaftam. Makshira begova. So this is very interesting. The Torah compares mezuzah to tefillin. What's the nature of that comparison? Makshira begova. Just like tefillin is put on the upper part, it's reference to the shorosh, right? So Rashi says over here, Makshira begova shorosh kedarmina b'hai pirka makom shemocha shel tinok rofes. Right? They will say, where's tefillin put? Tefillin is put on the top of the head. So just like tefillin is put on the quote unquote on the highest part of the head, af ksiva begova. So too again, mezuzah should go ahead and be put on the highest part of the doorway. Now, I will say, if you look at Rashi, this is actually very interesting. Manis af nesinas mezuzah begova pesach umashma samoch letikras hapesach yanichena. It makes it sound like that just like tefillin is put on the highest part of the head, so too mezuzah should be put on the highest part of the doorway. And this seems to contradict Shmuel, to which the Gemara says, Bishlam the Rav Huna, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Huna holds like Rabbi Yehuda. Right? Because Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda are saying the same thing, which is, don't put it within a tefach of the floor, and don't put it within a tefach of the upper lintel, but otherwise put it anywhere else. However, again, El Shmuel, the Amar Kiman, who does Shmuel hold? Because remember again, what did Shmuel hold? Shmuel said that halacha l'maisa, you have to put the mezuzah on the bottom of the upper third of the doorpost. Who does Shmuel hold like? Lo Rabbi Yehuda. So he doesn't like Rabbi Yehuda, right? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can put it anywhere except not in the first tefach or in the top tefach, and nor does he hold like Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi says it should be put on the highest part of the doorway. So who does Shmuel hold like? Amrav Huna Rav Nasan the Olam Rabbi Yossi. In reality, Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi. Now what does that mean? Because Rabbi Yossi holds, Rabbi Yossi notes the comparison between tefillin and mezuzah. Just like tefillin is put on the highest part of your head, so too mezuzah should be put on the highest part of the doorway. That sounds like the Rabbi Yossi is saying that tefillin should be put on the upper part of the doorpost. Amud Beis Rabbosai, umay tchilas shlish, and ultimately again, what does it mean? Right? Umay tchilas shlish ha'elyon. The ka'amar laharchika shalo laharchika min hakora shalmayla yoser mishlish. Rather interestingly enough, Rabbosai, when Rabbi Yossi says that you should put it on the upper part of the doorway, what it means is like this: you should put it within the top third of the doorway. That ultimately, again, you should not go ahead and distance it from the upper post more than the distance of 1/3 of the doorway. So quite fascinating. So it turns out that halacha l'maisa, Shmuel himself is saying like Rabbi Yossi. And I will say, just so you should know, that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Although there are other opinions in terms of where the mezuzah should be placed. Should the mezuzah be placed at shoulder height? The typical shear that Shulchan Aruch gives is in the bottom of the upper third of the doorway. Now, you have to start taking out a tape measure, but at least you're eyeballing it. So you imagine the doorway split into thirds. The mezuzah should be placed on the bottom of that upper third of the doorpost. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Amarava, Mitzvah Anicha B'Tevach Hasamach L'Shus Rabim. We saw this halacha before. Now, both say, so that's talking about placement of that's talking about where on the height of the doorway. Now we're talking where on the width of the doorway. So now that we've established you should place it in the bottom of the upper third of the doorway, next you should also place it within a tefach of the exterior of the doorway. My time, what's the reason? In order that you should encounter the mezuzah immediately, as quickly as possible upon entering the home. Right? We want your mezuzah to be, as soon as you enter your threshold, we want the mezuzah to be there. Rav Chanina Misura Omer, Kihechi Detintere. Ultimately, again, this way the mezuzah affords maximum protection. So I will say it's actually interesting. It's actually interesting that the mezuzah affords maximum protection. How? By going ahead and being put as close to the exterior on the doorway as possible. Remember, we mentioned this before, that the mezuzah protects against mazikin, whatever these spiritually destructive forces are. Also on a very practical level, what mezuzah reminds us of is that we must be careful about the influences we allow into our home. The home is the mikdash ma'at, right? The home is the mikdash ma'at, not just the shul. And the mezuzah reminds us that this home is a place of Kiddusha. So then we keep the mezuzah as close to the entryway of the home as possible to remind ourselves, what am I allowing in here? What is being allowed in my home? And I will say this is something incredibly important to consider. What am I allowing into my home in terms of printed material? What am I allowing into my home in terms of visual materials? What are the things that are spoken about in my home? What are the activities that happen inside of my home? Is this a home of Kiddusha, or is this a home, unfortunately, again, just an extension of the outside world? And the mezuzah is right there. As you walk in, it's almost as if the mezuzah is the border between the outside world and my home. And we keep that border as close to the exterior of the home as possible. So I need to constantly remind myself, I have to live in the outside world, and I have to navigate in the outside world. And of course, there are going to be parts of the outside world that follow me into my house, but there should be a limit from what from the outside world comes in. There should be a wall. There needs to be a mezuzah, and that mezuzah should form a type of blockage between some of the negative aspects of the outside world and the Kedusha and the holiness and the beauty of my home. Incredible. That's also the shmir. It's not just a protection against mazikin, against shadim or things like that. There's a lot of other mazikin in this world that don't come in the form of demons, come in the form of shems, but they come in the form of influence. And I will say again, that's why this is not like we know each other for a very long time. I tend not to be a kanoi on things. So I will say, you have to be so careful in terms of, just what we allow into our homes. There's such an ease of access for everything. And it is so easy to literally, again, access good and access bad. And we just have to be so careful specifically. Sometimes I can't control what I see in the world, but I absolutely need to control what I see and what I experience in the Kedusha of my home. The Gemara goes like, Bo'orei, such a beautiful Gemara. Bo'orei, Shalok Midas Chadash Baruch Hu Midas Basar Adam. See how different HaKadosh Baruch Hu is than man. Midas Basar Adam, when it comes to people, Melech Yoshe Mibithneim, Va'am Mishamin Osel Mibachutz. So again, when you have a human king, where does the human king? The human king lives inside the palace, and his servants are outside the palace to protect him and to guard him. Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eino Kain. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not like that. Rather, again, what happens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Avadav Yoshe Mibithnim, V'hu Mishamin Mibachutz. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his servants, us, we're on the inside, and he's on the outside protecting us. Isn't that beautiful? So the mezuzah is the Ribono Shel Olam B'chvoldo B'atzmo, himself. God, that's the love that Hashem has for us. The King of Kings says to us, you go inside, you stay inside, I will protect you. An earthly king, he lives on the inside. His servants have to protect him. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all he wants is our protection, our safety, our security. Shneimar, Hashem shomrecha, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. As the pasuk says, Hashem is your watchman, Hashem is your guardian, Hashem tzilcha. It's interesting, one of my favorite ideas in the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. We normally translate as Hashem tzilcha as Hashem is your shade. The Rebbe Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says Hashem is your shadow. Hashem is your shadow. What does a shadow do? Shadow does whatever you do. The whole essence of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is divine reciprocity. You want something from God, you put in what you get out. And Abba said, this is incredibly important. If you want a miracle from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you want something supernatural, you have to behave in a supernatural way as well. Right? You want something above and beyond from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, go above and beyond. You want something outside of the normal laws of nature, do something supernatural. Push yourself to do something that is totally supernatural for yourself. You put in what you get out. Sometimes we don't realize this because we want so much from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yet at the end of the day, I may myself only be investing in a minimal fashion. The more you want from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the more you have to put into that relationship. Hashem is my shadow. Darsh Rabbi Yosef, Bredor Mishnei Rava. So this is very interesting. So now we're talking about embedding the mezuzah in the doorway itself. So let's say you went ahead and you put that parchment, you put that mezuzah in the doorway. You pushed it into the doorway itself. If you did a tefach or more, the mezuzah is pasuk. As I remember again, it has to be al mezuzos beisecha b'sharecha. It has to be on the doorway, not in the doorway. So again, now it can be in the doorway, but not a tefach in. If it's more than a tefach in, then that's already in the structure, and therefore is going to be pasul. So the Gemara said, "Lema Maseyele." So the Gemara said, "Let's support this." Henicha befatzin o shetala ala malbein. If you went ahead and literally again, you embedded the mezuzah in a board, or you put it in a brick. Im yesh sham tefach, if there's a tefach of space, tzarich mezuzah acheres. So mezuzah is ineffective. Im lav eno tzarich mezuzah acheres. But again, if it's less than a tefach embedded in the structure, then that is totally fine. So Rabbi say, in Kitanya, when is this stated? So an interesting case over here, the Gemara says, talking about like a double doorway, like an entranceway behind the doorway. But we learned that explicitly. If you have an entranceway behind another doorway, if there's a tefach, you require another mezuzah. And if not, ultimately you don't need another mezuzah. I think Gemara says it's not redundant. The second case is just modifying the first. So we'll say, by the way, just an interesting idea. Where do you see this? You see this in the old city of Yerushalayim all the time, right? If you notice in the structures of the old city, so very often people don't have what we have, like an exterior mezuzah. Instead, what you notice is often there's like a little cavity carved into the stone, and the mezuzah itself is put into the stone. That's fine. Why? Because again, that's pretty much flush with the exterior. When is there a problem of embedding a mezuzah? if it's a tefach in, right? If you were to drill in a tefach, then already it's in the doorway as opposed to being on the doorway. Incredible. So we'll say, when is this so? Ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi, you don't have to get into Rashi yet. So Rashi says, when is this so? Shehamid ulbasof chata ve'nicha, aval chatach ve'niach ulbasof hamid ptula te'asa v'lo mina asri. Furthermore, again, I will say, this is what we were just talking about before. When is this so? This is true. Again, Gemara says that Allah Chalamayis, you put it there, and then ultimately, again, afterwards, you cut into the cavity and then you put it in. But if you went ahead and you cut in, and first you put it, and then ultimately, only afterwards you put up the doorpost, it's going to be possible. This is reminiscent of the Reish Galusa Rav Nachman case, right? If you were to put the mezuzah inside and then build the doorway around, doorpost around that, that would ultimately, again, go ahead and be problematic. So, Gemara Hani pischi shimoi piturin min hamazuzah. So these pischi shimoi. Now I will say, interestingly enough, pischi shimoi means inferior doorways or inferior doorposts. Our pater from mezuzah. So Gemara said, my pischi shimoi. What exactly is an inferior doorpost? So pligi ba Rav Richumi va'Abba Yossi. So machlokes chad amar deles lehu tikra, the chad amar deles lehu shikufi. One says it doesn't have a lintel, and one says it doesn't have doorposts. Now, both sides, this is incredibly important. What this is highlighting over here is in order for a doorway to be chayiv in mezuzah, it must have what's called a tzuras hapesach. And a tzuras hapesach, a doorway has a specific definition in halacha, which is 2 doorposts and a lintel. But however, again, if it does not have that, it is not called a doorpost. The Gemara calls it a pischi shimshi, a shimoi, an inferior doorway. Such an, and by the way, you have this all the time, right? Where you could have posts, but ultimately no piece that extends down, right? You have what looks like doorposts, but they just extend to the ceiling. Or sometimes you got something that drops down from the ceiling, but there's no defined doorpost. It's just wall. So technically speaking, in those circumstances, you're not chayiv in mezuzah. Mezuzah requires a doorway. Doorway means lintel and doorpost. Amar Rabbi Shila, Amar Rav Chisda, achsadra petura min mezuzah. Suddenly again, achsadra is going to be patur min mezuzah. Why? Lefi she'ein la petzimin. Because in achsadra, Rashi says over here, shalosh defanos stumos below pasach, v'aravias psucha legamre mitachas. So essentially, like an achsadra, it's kind of like a sukkah. It's kind of like a sukkah, right? But essentially, it's three walls with a totally open fourth side. So the Gemara says it's pater from mezuzah. Why? Because it doesn't have pitzimin. Pitzimin are side posts. It doesn't have side posts, and therefore Allah Chalamayisa not chayiv in mezuzah. Ha yesh la petzimin chayiv. Right, but 1 second. That sounds like if it did have side posts, you would be chayiv. Here's the issue: lechizok tikrahu da'avidi. But again, even so, those aren't real side posts. Those side posts would just be there to help hold up the schach, to help hold up, not schach because it's a sukkah, but because you wouldn't really put like a regular roof on this. That's what Rashi points out. You would just put like a more temporary roof. Hachikam means to say, the truth is in achsadra, even if you put side posts there, ultimately, again, it may still be pater. Why? Because ultimately, again, it is only there in order to go ahead and help hold up the ceiling, which sounds like I will say, by the way, interestingly enough, that if you have side posts that are not really there to create a doorway, but side posts that are there to, let's say, hold up a ceiling, that it sounds like that would not satisfy the criteria of Tzuras HaPesach, and would not be chayiv in mezuzah. Again, more on that. Amar Abaye, Chazinale, Lespalidi de Beimar, de Islay Petzime, the less lehu mezuzasa. So Abaye said, I saw the Ispalidi. What's an Ispalidi? So again, I will say, we're going to look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Achsadros. So apparently, Ispalidi is a lot like an Achsadra. Like an achsadra, kind of for our purposes, like a sukkah type structure. And yet again, it has side posts, but Allah Chalamayis didn't have any mezuzahs. Kasavra lechizok tikrahu da'avidi. So it sounds like over here that it was just made ultimately again to go ahead and that the side posts were not really there to create a doorway, but rather were there to hold up the ceiling. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, but yet, what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Lamaisa again. Actually, we'll say not. What we're going to stop over here. We'll pick up in Hashem with this Meisvei tomorrow. Some more about those disciples, just to share with you a short vart on the parsha. So we'll say. By the way, I just want to point out, so you should know, Gemara Maseches Menachos. This is Hilchos Mezuzah, obviously, as you've seen. Right? I'm saying this is the sugya in Shas for Hilchos Mezuzah. And you can see again, just rapid fire halacha, one piece after the other. Just a short idea before we dive in Shachar. It's a really beautiful idea. Pasuk says, Ve'ila mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. So Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, these are the mishpatim, these are the laws that you shall place before Klal Yisrael. Now, if you notice, by the way, just what's happened over just the juxtaposition of Parashios. Parashas Yisro was Kabbalah Torah, Sinaitic revelation. And it is there that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Moshe Rabbeinu a whole treasure trove of spiritual details, many of them related to our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Parashas Mishpatim is almost exclusively, not almost, but it's pretty much exclusively related to Bein Adam L'Chavero, interpersonal laws of damages, tort law, all these different things. So listen to this idea. So the pasuk says, these are the laws that you shall place before them. Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara understands over here, Rashi HaKadosh explains, Lifneihem means, Chash Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, you shall go ahead and put it before Klal Yisrael k'shulchan orech. Don't just tell Klal Yisrael mutter aser, but rather give them explanation. Don't just tell them do this, do that. Put it before them. Give it over to them in a way that is digestible and understandable. Rabbi said, the great tzaddik Reb Simcha Bonim Pshischa says something amazing. The Rebbe says, Lifneihem. What does it mean? These are the mishpatim that you shall place before them. We always translate before them as before Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe says, Limda Torah. Sheyu mishpatim. Kadosh Baruch Hu is telling us the mishpatim which govern in bein adam lechavero. Hainu mitzvos shebein adam lechavero lifnei hakol. Ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneim doesn't just simply mean these are the laws that you shall give over before Klal Yisrael, but rather these are the laws that come before everything. They come before everything. Meaning what? Lifnei hakol. Lifnei mitzvos shebein adam lemakom. To teach us that the mitzvos bein adam lechavero, the interpersonal mitzvos which teach us how to create and structure our relationship with each other, they come even before the mitzvos bein adam lemakom, the mitzvos before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Derech eretz kadma laTorah, teaching us a very simple yet profound yesod. HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares more about how we treat each other than ultimately, again, our relationship with Him. Derech eretz kadma laTorah. And now again, I will say, obviously, it's not an either or. We need both. You need both. Obviously, a person has to become proficient in their bein adam lechavero and in their bein adam lemakom. But sometimes, if you wonder what is most important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says Reb Shischa, ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. This is what you should tell Klal Yisrael. What comes first? What is primary? Bein adam lechavero. Rabbi say it is so easy in the cultivation of a spiritual identity to become so makbid, so careful, so meticulous in the details regarding our relationship with God, and then either intentionally or inadvertently trample over the other. Just like any parents, right? What I know, my wife always tells my kids from the times that they were little, the most important rule that she always espoused to them was, you must treat each other well. You do well on a test, you don't do well on a test, okay, well, we could deal with that, right? You, whatever profession you want to do, that's not the ikr, right? At the end of the day, the most important thing is how you treat one another. That's what every single parent wants from their kids. A parent wants to be able to sit at a table with their children and know that their children love each other, will take care of each other, and will look out for one another. Everything else is an inconsequential detail. If that's what human parent wants, then al-achas kama v'kama, that's what the Ribono Shel Olam wants from us as well. He wants us to love one another. He wants us to look out for each other. He wants us to take care of each other. Ve'ela mishpatim, tell Klal Yisrael, these mishpatim, which govern our relationship with each other, ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem, tell Klal Yisrael to place importance on these interpersonal laws, bein adam lechavero, even before bein adam lemakom, even before bein adam lemakom. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks for more than anything is how we take care of each other, how we love one another, and how we look out for each other. Place these halachas front and center, and that's ultimately how we make our Father happy. We'll say, Shrech, what a week, a good Shabbos, everyone. Tremendous. Have on Zoom, good Shabbos. Shabbos, good Shabbos. In Eretz Yisrael, in Florida, in New York, everyone is Baruch Hashem. We have a growing Florida contingent now. Okay, so I think we have a Florida Muslim.